Hello, you're very welcome to Transform, the Digital Government Podcast, presented by me, Maeve Neefsey. I started one of Ireland's first digital marketing agencies and since then have been working in digital transformation. Digital government, you might say, is a passion, and so much so that I was a founder of the Ireland e-Government Awards and Summit that recognises the very best working in digital transformation. We'll be celebrating our 21st birthday on the 19th of September in Dublin. So in every episode, we bring you the top names behind some of the most exciting public sector transformation projects globally. And this is really a unique chance for anyone working in digitising our public sector to get some inside tips from talented leaders who've been there and done that. You could say that my super guest today has transformed your life, because many of us remember having to queue endlessly in the rain to be able to actually leave this country. And today's guest ended all of that. He's also responsible for helping you find out if you are officially dead or alive. And he's also brought the Garda technology into the 21st century to make sure that the good guys win. So I'm delighted to welcome you very much, Joe, to Transform, the Digital Government Podcast. So welcome.
Thanks very much, Maeve. I'm a bit embarrassed going very red here.
We just have to get over our modesty, right? But you've been involved in some of the most important, really, and ambitious projects for almost, 30 years you were in the civil service as a public servant?
Yeah. I've been very fortunate to work with some extraordinary individuals, and I guess that happenstance of being in the right place at the right time with the right people allowed me to start something very different. A really wise chief executive I worked with, a woman called Leonie Lunny, said to me, it's probably 25 years ago, Joe, you have to remember you can't underestimate the power of good and the power of bad you can do, even from the back office. So always think of that and think very carefully about the power of good you can bring. And I hope that's what I've been able to do over my career.
Well, there's some people who might say that the fact that there is that power makes them very nervous about doing anything. So the fact that you've gone on and done so many big projects says something a little bit about you, not just about that power, right? I mean, if you think about it, when you joined the civil service, did you ever think you'd be involved in such major innovation?
No, I look back, my first day was in the civil service was a fluke in that I had been delayed starting, and as a result, I ended up in a place with an individual who was doing a technology project for the area I was in, and I was interested, and that got me involved. If I'd started the week before, who knows where I would have gone. But again, finding those right people over my career, people like Leonie Lunny, as I mentioned, Dermot Gleeson in the Attorney General's office, Jim Duffy as well, powerful people who a lot of the public wouldn't be aware of. But I guess working with them and towards a strong commitment on my part to try and do things better, to try and make the engagement of the public service that much easier. And I hope I've done that. I think I have.
Well, look, we'll talk about your projects because that has been demonstrated over and over again. So you really have touched everybody's lives in so many ways. But I remember one of my own personal experiences when we were working in a project was the e-Cabinet, which was Colin Butler. And part of that work was to go and talk to some of the end users. And it became really clear that the ministers actually didn't even know how to use email. So there are some shocking things when you start that you just have to deal with. Did you ever come across anything like that really kind of took you back a bit?
I think when I moved in as head of ICT to Foreign Affairs, I was really taken aback. That's 2002, in advance of the presidency, just how lax the state of technology was there. Here we were going into one of Ireland's most important roles in Europe, and yet we had a dial-up email system to our embassies around the world, and with email failing more regularly than it was working. So it was a real eye-opener at that back office level about just how critical the infrastructure would be. Equally, when I look in my time in the AG's office, the absence of access to legislation was just appalling. And if it meant at the time, if you wanted to find out about a statute, you in essence either had to go and buy a piece of paper out of government publications on Moses Street or go to a solicitor and talk to them. So, things have moved on enormously in that short space of time.
And do you mean public access?
Public access, yeah. And there was certainly a very strong attitude at the time that providing the public with access to the law was almost a risk because, God forbid, they might actually understand what's being said in these complex statutes. And certainly in digitizing the statute book, which is one of my first big roles in transformation, there was a bit of pushback on that. Lawyers were very concerned about this. Even when the material had been captured and was about to be made available, there was a real strong effort to try and put a very substantial charge on getting access to that material, which would have meant it would have only been effectively available to large solicitors' practice. So even the small solicitor wouldn't have been able to afford the sort of money that was being talked of. But again, in engaging with the attorney, Dermot Gleeson, it was very much about making sure that people could get at the material. They weren't going to interpret it, but actually read it. And by providing it available, free in essence on the web, which would have been 2002, around 2000, wouldn't have been very heavily used at that time. So it was a novel approach to transformation.
And I suppose I've come across this, I'm sure you have, that people's fears of what the terrible outcomes would be are really rarely realised, when you open up access. So what were they worried about by opening it up?
I think that sense of maybe a concern that people would misinterpret what the statutes would be was prevalent. But it sort of underestimates that the public are intelligent people who can read, who can understand, who can get a sense of what the base material would be. Clearly, decisions made in court are complex, and so you would need to go to a legal professional for assistance. But the base level knowledge of the law was really important, and that just wasn't there at the time. There was dusty books on shelves in offices around the country. And that was the only way that people could get it. As I said, go in and buy a copy of one statute for a reasonable amount of money in government publications. Thankfully, we've moved on enormously from there. And thankfully, at the heart of that was that sense about empowering the public, about giving them the power to decide what they wanted to do.
And do you think there were really positive outcomes of enabling people to get access?
Oh, I'm certain. Over the course of the years, people wouldn't have been aware of my involvement in that project, and we would have just talked generally. And their access and them going off and getting at material, I smiled as I saw this and said, well, 10 years ago or 5 years ago or whatever, that wouldn't have been possible. So unquestionably, having that material made an awful difference, and allowing people to see linkages between, hypertext links between statutes became something that we're just so used to now, but at the time was very different and very empowering for the public who, if they wanted to know what the particular legislation in any given area was, just suddenly made it easier for them to go and have a look.
And, you mentioned there resistance maybe. Internal resistance can be a problem, pushback. Would you have any guidance for somebody who's kind of starting a project that they know or they're experiencing pushback of how you coped with that, how you dealt with it?
I think for me, you mentioned at the start about queues outside the passport office in Moulder Street. It seems bizarre at this time, but there was internal resistance to put in place an appointment system because it was felt it would become a barrier as opposed to providing something very easy for the public to access. I always believed in that, and I stood by my beliefs. I engaged with others to make sure that I wasn't saying something that was crazy. And took a small step around that to allow for that. So in the case of the appointment service, it was very much about allowing some walk-ins, as they were called, so that if people did get into difficulty, you weren't blocking them out entirely. It's interesting as we get into this space at the moment about discussions around GAA Go and the challenges for the older or less digitally aware members of our community. It's interesting to think, those arguments that we're hearing today are the same arguments that we were hearing 25 years ago. So I'd say to people, first start by looking at what you're trying to do and putting at the heart of it the customer experience. And I think if you start there and stay in that space, you can't go too far wrong. And then talk to others. There are plenty of others who've been around who have looked at this and it might have tackled exactly the same problem, but have had similar problems. And talk to them and get a sense of what's there. And I think out of that, as I said, putting the customer at the heart of the decisions really makes all the difference.
But if you've got somebody who's, quite senior, and I presume it's very hard if they're not against what you're proposing. I presume you have to get a groundswell of support internally.
Yeah, and that certainly was my experience around passports. I wouldn't say that there were individuals who were, who were obstructive, but they were certainly very cautious. And it was about convincing, and it was about meeting with others, and it was about meeting with others who weren't maybe directly involved in the process, and having that conversation to build a sense of momentum around getting this in place. And in the appointment service, in the online passport service, that was the case. It was about building internal momentum around people who weren't directly involved in consular affairs, and allowing that pressure build internally to a point where it becomes an inevitability. It comes to the point where you almost have to go ahead and proceed.
Yeah. You've made that, and you've created a kind of the conversation everywhere.
Yeah, and I want to be careful, it's not about imposing your views either. I think you have to be sensible, and you've got to sense check your own thoughts with others. And I think in doing that, as I said, putting the customer first starts the conversation, and you can move from there.
One of the other projects that I've always loved that you were very much involved in was the citizen information, bringing citizen information online. And it really has transformed people's access to information that would be really time consuming to find. In fact, you probably wouldn't find it and you'd be confused because you're linking so many different pieces of information from different departments, which leads me to the question, which is collaboration. So cross-organisational collaboration. You've done it in so many projects. Are there any kind of pillars that you would suggest somebody work on if they're going to do something that's wide?
Sure. I certainly think that you've got to work on those sorts of initiatives in a non-threatening fashion. You've got to work with others to try and allow them see the benefits from their own perspective around what's there. So I take citizens' information. What was Oasis when I was involved? It was about engaging with our agencies around the country and assuring them.
These are people at the front.
No. Senior managers
okay.
at the back, ensuring them that we weren't trying to take over their domain, ensuring them that we weren't trying to criticise the way that material was there, but step back and say what we wanted was a consistent perspective on a material that was there for the public. And it was about writing it in a fashion that was easily understood, plain English. As we keep talking about it now, we go into an election, and plain English is at the heart of what we're talking about there. So plain English, non-threatening ideas. And I think that it was building that consensus that what was being achieved was one route into the information. Ultimately, if somebody was interested in tax material, they were going to go to revenue. But if they wanted some preliminary material that would give them some advice and assistance, providing something that was easily understood in a non-technical, non-jargon fashion was a game changer.
But you were taking information that might kind of belong to different departments, weren't you?
Absolutely.
And I mean, rewriting it for simple understanding. I mean, did people feel territorial about that, or how did you get beyond that?
I think there were some agencies that were territorial. There were others who recognised the value of this, that it was another route into information. I always tell people you can't dictate how somebody is going to land on a piece of key information. They can come at it through any or multiple different ways. So whether it's a search engine or whether it's referral or whether it's whatever, So therefore, clearly people could produce the material in the way that they wanted. What citizens' information does is that it brings that consistency of delivery. It brings that easily understood information. And it's written on the back of their direct engagement with citizens' information officers all around the country who hear at first hand the sort of questions that people are asking all the time that perhaps aren't exposed to the agency themselves. So writing the material in that consistent way, using professional writers, and that was a big interest for me, that you had people who understood how to write in that simple fashion. And that's not a skill that we all have. And certainly there were some skilled individuals who work there who can produce this material consistently.
And I presume there's people who probably need the services more than anybody, more vulnerable in our society, might have challenges, with things that aren't plain English. And did you find any anecdotal information about people afterwards? They said, "God, thank God for what you've done. It's made a difference for me." Because there was a big case in the UK, wasn't there, where somebody couldn't understand what their rights were in relation to a service, and it had some really negative outcomes.
I've certainly spoken to family members who wouldn't have been aware that I was involved in this, who've just talked about their challenge and going to citizens' information to give them that initial step into the space. Say, okay, yeah, so here are the rules that relate to this service. Here are the payments that I should be entitled to. And out of that, have had a more engaged conversation with the direct service provider. And I would be aware of people who have pulled up those service providers and said, well, hang on a second, this particular rule says that I'm entitled to this. And in fairness to the agencies, there hasn't been pushback. It tends to be just that churn of people who perhaps don't have that in-depth knowledge. And so having this tool, having this information resource becomes a very empowering for everybody concerned.
Mm. And so for you, what was your favourite project?
I have a grow for passports. I can't get away from that. I think that the state of where we were with passports when I arrived was quite significant.
I think we should remind people, because maybe not everybody remembers, there was queues all the way down the street, wasn't there? People missing trips. There was it was a complete disaster at one stage, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And it was paper-based, and it was a system that was primarily delivered via the post, and very difficult to intervene because the material just wasn't there. We'd problems with photograph quality, all sorts of issues. The passport card, which is a real pet favourite of mine, came about as a result of just looking at the experience of large numbers of individuals who are going to concerts around the country. And we would get boxes, and I mean genuinely a large A4 paper ream box full of passports that had been lost in the middle of a field down in the Midlands. So it was there.
I never heard that one before.
Yeah, so it was there to show people, actually, if you had something that's simple that you can carry around in your pocket, that's less likely to be lost, that you could then use to travel internationally, that you could use to get on a plane without any difficulty, that you could use at e-gates that are in place, would become something that was a game changer. And unquestionably that's the case. And that project, small as it was as it started, allowed the testing of an online application process, which has been rolled out. And when I left the passport service, the processing was in the order of about 500, 600,000 passports a year. Well, last year it's 1 million. And to think about how you would have done that in a paper age.
It's for all countries? It's not for all countries? Do we have to do special deals with different countries in order to be able to use the card? How does that work?
So I have my own card here. And this is the second version of the card that I had. And it's primarily of use for travel in the European Union and some associated states. And it, as I said, made it easier for people, business people as well. I've seen and been smiling at people who turn up at airport gates and present their card and walk through. It involved quite a body of work when the concept was there. So I should say it's not an identity card. It is an actual passport. So the International Civil Aviation Organization, who are responsible for passport standards, had a standard for a passport in that format, in that card format. And it was leveraging on the back of that. As I mentioned, it came about thinking about the problems that kids had losing their passport books in fields down at concerts around the country, but very quickly could be seen by others as almost allowing people have a second document to enable them travel. And it certainly got a lot of people out of difficulty in that way. Engagement with the airlines was critical. We needed to make sure that the main carriers coming out of this country were on board with it. And once we could assure them that this was a passport standard, they had no problems with that as an issue. And our EU members equally were supportive of that process. So I had expected there'd be far more challenges internationally. In fact, that didn't be the case because we stuck by the standard. Had we deviated from the standard, perhaps it would have been more difficult. I know, for example, there was quite a considerable thought about whether the PPS number should be included on the card. I think that would have changed the dynamic and may well have killed the card in the first instance.
Are you talking about people's resistance to what they see as a form of ID?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges we as a country have got to face up to. We pride ourselves in the privacy that we provide to individuals, while at the same time we criticise the challenges around connecting up government. And we criticise about the overuse of PPS number, and we criticise about somebody not being able to pass information from one area to another. I think that becomes a real issue. And I think as a society, we need to step up and consider that. I travelled to the States earlier this year and handed over my fingerprints at the border control area to the US authorities. Perhaps an entity that, if you step back, we might be more critical about how they would use those fingerprints. And yet, I certainly, we would not see much enthusiasm around handing fingerprints over to the Irish authorities. The passport book in itself includes a chip, and there's very basic information that's held on the chip. The chip includes the sort of material that appears on the photograph page of the book itself. Our European partners have included the fingerprints of individuals, or at least an algorithm associated with the fingerprints of the individual on their book. And I don't think we're ready for that. I don't think we're ready to do that. And certainly, had we gone down that road, we would have had huge pushback. That said, we live in an era where an individual comes out of a prison and it's not known to the victim. It's not known to the Garda member who was involved in the case. It's not known to the courts who provided that information. And there's something not quite right about that. I mean, there are certainly huge efficiencies to be gained by having a far more honest discussion around identity of individuals. How that's done, I mean, that's a technical challenge for individuals.
So you think we want our cake and eat it, is it? We want all the benefits of independence, but we also want cross-government integration and service.
Unquestionably.
And in terms of the numbers, you said numbers there. Why has the passport demand gone through the roof? What's been going on? Is it just our population increase, or more travelling, or? I
think there were a lot of people who weren't applying for passports at the time. We changed the dynamic probably around before I'd started to require children to have passports, as opposed to having the children have passports on their parents' documents. So that's an international change. And there was also an increase in demand internationally. I think people saw the value of having an EU passport for travel. And, all of the anecdotal information that we see out there suggests that there are a lot of people in Britain who have taken up that option to have that EU passport on the back of their entitlement to an Irish document. So that led to a massive demand. And there's no doubt in my mind the Passport Service would not have been able to cope with that level of demand without having the technology material that's there that they have today.
The user experience, because I did my renewal, which is fantastic in timing, it was just by accident. And I don't know, did it take us 10 minutes? 10 minutes? The only hard part was the photograph because you can't smile. But it really has transformed something that used to be an absolute pain. But I know simplicity comes hard, right? So the user interface, did you have, it is very smooth. But a lot of work go into that, or just get it right by luck?
No. I think there was a lot of thought went into the whole process. And as I said, it started off with testing it on something that wasn't the primary demand, which was the passport card, and learning from that experience of that interaction. And there certainly would have been usability changes that were made on foot of the passport card experience to make it that bit easier. The photographs, as you mentioned, is one of the biggest challenges that people have in applying, especially for renewing their passport. And those photo booths that exist around the country are excellent because they are checking the quality of your photograph, the proper nature of that photograph at the point of capture. Whereas with no disrespect to other places, those you couldn't be sure about everybody's understanding of what a passport quality photograph should be. So that opportunity to digitally extract that information and get that in without having to scan the photograph, without having to have that material come in, makes a big change. And that was a big plus for the Passport Service to deliver on that and to make that experience so much easier. So somebody going into their photo booth can essentially, within minutes, have their passport application completed. And as we've seen, and you can just look on social media and you'll see those who apply for passports on a Sunday afternoon getting their document out on the Monday or Tuesday. And that's, credit to my former colleagues in those areas who've done Trojan work to continue to update and improve the service.
It must also be a more pleasurable job. I mean, who wants to be working in a place where there's people queuing outside the door, or the opposite, when people say, look, this works? So is it very rewarding, do you think?
I think it's changed. I had many a sit down with individuals who'd left things to not only the last minute, but the last second to apply. And the tensions and pressures that they would have experienced are understood now through proper advertising campaigns and through that confidence that updating or renewing your adult passport is a relatively simple process. And for that reason, I think it has made the experience for the staff so much better. They ultimately, all they ever wanted was to get passports out quickly. I think technology in this case has transformed the way they can go about delivering on that service. Well,
look, this is a very good segue into saying we haven't talked once about technology. Can you believe it? But we're going to come back and we'll talk about some of that in terms of some of the projects you did and some of the people you worked with. So thank you. That's it from this episode of Transform, the Digital Government Podcast. And I want to thank my guest, of course, Joe Nugent, the producer, Conal O'Moran, our station manager, Peter Rice, on sound, Lee Brennan, and of course, videographer, Juliana Verkovic. I hope I've said that correctly. And we're here in the South Dublin podcast studio. So thank you, everybody.